Hello and welcome to another video. Yesterday I went to see the new Blair Witch film, and I wanted to give my thoughts on it and talk about what I thought worked in the film, what didn't. So yeah, let's do that. If you were around in the mid '90s, then you can't help but get caught up in, or at least be aware of, the hype surrounding the original Blair Witch. Um, it was in 1994, I believe it was. And whilst he'd had films before that used kind of like the found footage mechanic, or like documentary kind of mechanic, um, films like The Last Broadcast, for example, it wasn't until Blair Witch Project came along that really caught fire. And it was essentially a student film project, and it was made for very, very small amount of money, and it made a hell of a lot of money at the box office. In fact, I even contributed to that because I went to see the film twice in the cinema, um, and I really enjoyed it. It really kind of like caught my imagination. It was a very creepy, atmospheric film. It didn't really show you anything. It just kind of like built up the atmosphere, and it just worked for me. Um, a lot of people actually thought that it was real when it came out, because it was like marketed like that. There was a whole viral campaign on the internet which was unheard of at the time, and it kind of like made these fake news reports about these three missing guys, and they even went so far as to make a couple documentaries about this Blair Witch, which obviously it was all fiction, but it was presented as fact, and it really caught people's imagination. And it was kind of like a new way to do horror films. It's almost as though the film itself um, wasn't the only thing that the Blair Witch Project was. It also encompassed the books and the documentaries and the interviews and stuff like that. The whole thing together kind of like made one big package, and it was a really interesting way to do a horror film. Um, then a couple of years later, they decided to make a second Blair Witch film. Now this one went the rather daring route of proclaiming the first film as fiction, and then telling like a new story, um, with the basis being that first film was just a movie, but it was based on kind of like real stories, and there is like a real Blair Witch that it was based on. And the second film was kind of like all about that. They ditched the found footage mechanic, apart from like one scene where it played like quite an integral part, and the entire film was kind of like a metaphor for how we view media. And on that front, it kind of like did an okay job. On all other fronts, it kind of failed. I mean, it's not a bad film, but coming after the Blair Witch Project, it just it was just not what people were expecting, and it just kind of like failed miserably. It's not a brilliant film. It's an okay film. I actually quite enjoy it for what it is, but you can't really see it as anything other than just kind of like a standalone film. So last year, or I think it was earlier this year actually, they started doing promotion for a new horror film called The Woods, and they showed like a few clips on Instagram and here and there, and really hyping up this movie, saying like this is one of the most terrifying movies of all time. And everyone was kind of like building up hype for this movie, and it was getting quite a lot of traction. And then a few months back, they kind of revealed, actually this isn't called The Woods. This is actually Blair Witch. This is like a sequel to the Blair Witch Project. And that was kind of like a really interesting way to do that, because I think if they had marketed it originally as a Blair Witch film, it wouldn't have caught fire so much in people's imagination. And because of the box office flop that was the second film, people would have thought, oh, another Blair Witch film, not going to bother with that. But by building up the hype as something else, and then when people are hyped telling them that there's a Blair Witch film, I think that kind of helped. And obviously there have been so many films since the original Blair Witch that have used the found footage mechanic so much that it's almost become a cliche in a lot of horror films now. But they decided, I guess they decided, we were kind of like the original, so we're gonna show them how it's done, kind of. Because most of them aren't very good. I have to say, I watched one on Netflix a couple of days ago called Invoked. That was terrible. And there have been kind of like one or two come along and say, well, I say one or two, there have been hundreds come along, and most of them have been terrible. You do get the occasional decent one. I believe Grave Encounters was fairly decent, and a handful of others. Cloverfield used it to great effect. Cloverfield is another film that I went to see in cinema twice, because that just kind of like really took that mechanic and put it in a completely different kind of film, and that just worked for me. A lot of people hated it, but a lot of people hated Blair Witch Project anyway. So they kind of like used that, and they used that hype and put that hype into a new Blair Witch film. Kind of like just moved it across. I don't know why I'm carrying scissors right now. So I think that helped, and it suddenly got people interested in a Blair Witch film where they might not have been interested before. So I kind of like avoided all of the trailers. As soon as I found out that it was Blair Witch film, I avoided the rest of the trailers. I didn't watch them because I wanted to be surprised. So I went to see it on Monday. Yesterday I went to see it, and I went in with like high expectations, because this is kind of like it's a sequel to the original. It completely ignores the second one completely, which is a good thing. And they kind of like go with the premise that there is this guy that he's Heather's younger brother. Heather, one of the characters from the first film who went missing. This guy is her younger brother, and he was like 4 years old when she disappeared, and he's always wanted to find out what happened to her. And he comes across this footage that someone's posted online from a DV cam that was like found in the area, and he's put this footage online, and he thinks he can see his sister in this footage. So he goes to the area with a bunch of friends to investigate, and meets the guy who put the footage on the internet, and they all go together into the woods to kind of like search for it. Now, the original Blair Witch, it kind of like really thrived on its atmosphere. Like I say, it didn't really show anything. It was all about the atmosphere, and ever since that film came out, there have been certain tropes in horror that have been really kind of like overused, but they've kind of like become part of the horror kind of like blueprint, as it were, for like the modern horror films. And they've obviously taken what worked in the original, try to update it, and add a lot of these new modern horror beats that you'll find in a lot of the modern ones today. Now, one of the major ones obviously is jump scares. You can't watch a horror film which these days, which doesn't have like major jump scares in it every 5 minutes. If done right, then jump scares can be a really good way of kind of like releasing a bit of tension. I think it worked really well in a few of the Paranormal Activity films, especially the first two. There are jump scares that kind of like relieve a bit of tension. You've still got like an atmosphere of dread going through the films, but at certain points it kind of like peaks, and when it gets to that point, it can be a little bit unbearable. So you do a jump scare, and then it goes back down to the original level again. It's kind of like a psychological trick in a way, and it's a way of relieving tension. Some films really just put jump scares in the films and just don't bother with any atmosphere. But when done well, they can kind of like work together. This particular film, I don't think did it well because what they use, and they do this a lot, is they will have something fairly ordinary, something very ordinary, like there were like six people out in the woods, and you'll be thinking, oh, something's going to happen, something's going to happen, and then all of a sudden there's a really really loud sound on the soundtrack. It kind of like the soundtrack kind of like spikes up in volume, like really really far, kind of like how you do in a jump scare. Because in a lot of films they'll have like a jump scare, it's just like that, and it's like bang, you'll hear like a bit of a scream or something like that, a bit of a loud noise. And a lot of films early on, they'll do like these fake out jump scares where it's actually nothing scary, but you still get the loud noise, which kind of like tricks you into thinking it's a jump scare, and it kind of like makes you it makes you jump, obviously, because that's its intention, but it immediately kind of like dissipates, kind of, because you realize, it's not actually something scary. And Blair Witch does this a lot. There are points in the film where you'll hear this loud peak, and all it is someone just walking on leaves next to the character whose viewpoint you're looking at, and all of a sudden, bam, one of your friends is there, and it's kind of like just a really really fake way of doing it. There's another time where it's used in the case of someone's phone beeping, and for some reason the phone just beeps really really loudly just for that one point, just for the purposes of kind of like creating a jump scare. And if done once or twice, if used sparingly, that can be an effective way, like I said before, of kind of like relieving that tension, as long as the layer of atmosphere is there. In this particular case, it is overused. It happens. It must happen like 7 or 8 times throughout the first like hour of the film. You just get these fake out jump scares, and it comes to the point where every single time there's kind of like a moment of dread in the film, a moment where the atmosphere is like built up a little bit. You know that it's going to be dissipated by one of these fake jump scares, by a jump scare that's not actually scary. It's just someone else, and I was sitting there in cinema. It was just really really irritating me, because jump scares are not a way to create atmosphere. They're a way, like I said before, to kind of like bring that peak down a little bit. And if used well, it can work, but you have to use it sparingly, and you have to have that atmosphere of kind of like horror, terror, kind of like they're building up to begin with. Excuse me. And this film just didn't. The last 20 or so minutes of the film, it's almost like a different film, and that does kind of like try and bring up a bit of atmosphere to the proceedings. But before that atmosphere it isn't really there, because every time you get that little bit of atmosphere, you get the fake out jump scare, and it just you're just sitting there thinking to yourself that was absolutely pointless. And there's kind of like a way that you can do fake out jump scares, and there's a way to not do them. The way to not do them is just to make a random normal sound really really loud for a second. That is not the way to do it. It's unnatural. That's not how sound works. it's just a very very fake way of doing it, and it just comes at the expense of the film, unfortunately. Now, I'm not saying the film was terrible, because it wasn't, but it ended up being average. And being a direct sequel to a film which had that atmosphere building up and building up and building up, all the way to the point of the, in my opinion, perfect last shot, it just it just comes off as weak. And they said in the marketing material, "Oh, one of the most terrifying films ever made." It's like, no, it isn't. It really isn't. And kind of like in the um, in the first film, you don't really see much, and until you get to like the last 20 minutes, like I said, it becomes like a completely different film, and you need to have the atmosphere there in order for that to work. It has to be there. Otherwise, it's just not a scary film. All that you're left with is your fake out jump scares, and that's it. And it just doesn't work. Now, that was like my main problem with the film. There are other problems with the film. You do instead of having like a handheld camcorder this time, like you had in the first ones, in the first one, sorry, you've got these kind of like cameras that go over the characters' ears. So without them having to hold a camera, you're kind of like seeing through their eyes because the camera's like right there, and it's kind of like you see what they see, basically. What that means is that while someone's running, they can still hold a camera like that. But while someone's running, their head is moving a hell of a lot. You know, you run like that, your head is going everywhere, and you'll notice if you watch the film, the um, the camera throughout the entire film just looks like that, just constantly, and it's really really difficult to kind of like follow what's going on a lot of the time. A lot of the time, you've got scary stuff that's happening. You know, something will happen in the background of a shot. Like I think that without going into kind of like spoilers, at one point something in the back of the shot kind of like rushes upwards, and because the character's actually like running at the time, you you can't really tell what you've seen. It's like the movie is telling you, the soundtrack is telling you that something scary just happened, but you're sitting there and you see it and thinking, what actually did just happen? I actually have no idea. And that actually happened a few times, and I found myself thinking, okay, I'm just gonna have to pretend that I know what's going on at the minute in order to kind of like get over it, because I don't think the film's going to tell me what actually happened. The film did just try to tell me what happened and failed, so it's not kind of like going to go into more detail and like explain what I'm actually looking at. So that was another major problem with the film, and that problem becomes even more um, like exacerbated in the last 20 minutes of the film because everyone's running everywhere. And you do eventually get to this is kind of like another horror trope, which is really really annoying and overused, and it just annoys me so much when I see it. You kind of like see something in the background of a shot, like a monster or a ghost or whatever. I mean, I'm not saying there's like ghosts and shit in this film, because but you'll see something and then there'll be like a scream or a screech, and it's like just this kind of like kind of like in the soundtrack, which goes like really really high in the soundtrack again, and usually accompanied by a peak in the music as well. And it's like, why does every single ghost and monster and whatever in a horror film have to scream? Why? They just all scream, and it's become overused and tired, and it just for me, that is another way of killing the atmosphere. I mean, don't get me wrong. The sound design, the way that the sound is kind of like built up with the sound design team, sound effects team, the soundtrack team, um, it does often like send a chill down your spine, just because mechanically how that sound's been put together. Um, it just kind of like tingles your kind of like spine. That's what it's designed to do. It is a sound designed to creep you out, and it has certain notes in it that kind of like your brain recognizes as something kind of like terrifying. And that happens a few times in this film. It's not overused, but it's like the the monster doesn't scream unless it's in the back of someone's shot, unless it's just walked into the back of someone's shot, and then all of a sudden it starts screaming and does that thing, and it just it's just something that annoys me in horror films, and it annoyed me in this one as well. Now, like I said, they kept saying that like it was the most terrifying movie of all time, and it's clearly not. Clearly not. I mean, I shouldn't have expected it to be really. The marketing hype is really ever right about films like this. Um, but I just found myself disappointed. I really wanted to put this film kind of like in my top horror films list, and it just ended up falling flat on so many levels that I just can't do that. It's unfortunate, and it's not like, let me start again. It's there are ways to do horror films, make them scary without resorting to horror tropes to get that fear across. And if you look at another film that came out this year, well, it came out towards the end of last year actually, The Witch. Now that is a film about a New England family who are exiled out into the woods, and they're kind of like terrorized by this witch. Now that film doesn't have any jump scares at all. There are no soundtrack peaks where it kind of like tries to trick you into being scared. That film is one of the most atmospheric horror films that I have ever seen. I thought The Witch was brilliant. It is definitely, if not my favorite horror film of the last decades, definitely my second favorite. And it does that all without relying on all these tropes. It just builds this story, builds this atmosphere, and it doesn't let you go. It's got an amazing soundtrack, which kind of like helps with that as well. And that film showed that you can actually do a modern horror film and kind of like not resort to tropes to make it scary, which hasn't been done well since kind of like the 80s. Like for films like The Shining, I mean, The Shining did it perfectly, absolutely perfectly. Stuff like Alien and The Wicker Man, the Omen, stuff like that. And as much as I don't like the film, The Exorcist did it did like really well. I'm not a fan of The Exorcist, but it did have kind of like that atmosphere of dread going through it, and it didn't have to rely on jump scares. Although in my opinion, it did rely too much on the gross out stuff. It relied too much on the shock value, which is why I don't really like The Exorcist. Excuse me, I do still have a bit of a cough. Um, my I said that's like my second favorite horror film of the past decade. The Evil Dead remake would be my absolute favorite. that is a completely different film to The Witch. That is kind of like a balls to the wall kind of gross out horror film. It's meant to be. It's essentially if you've kind of like seen my gameplay videos of Doom, of like the 2016 Doom, the Evil Dead remake is kind of like that. That film if it were a movie. I mean, I'm not saying it's like based on Doom because it's not, but it's that kind of like, we're just gonna throw everything in the kitchen sink at you. We're not gonna take ourselves too seriously. We're just here for like a really really fun time, and it becomes just a fantastic horror film. It doesn't, like I say, it doesn't take itself too seriously, and it is just balls to the wall. That doesn't have much in the way of jump scares in it, actually, but it is incredibly graphic. It's probably one of the most graphic horror films I've seen, and well, I think the if I was going to give it a one word description, I'd probably say like unsubtle. Um, if Lionsgate want to release a film again and put my quote on the box, just put unsubtle, Matthew Hudson, um, because that perfectly describes the film. That perfectly described Doom as well. So Bethesda, if you want to give me some money and put my quote on the box, just Doom unsubtle, um, and that that can sometimes work. That is a very different kind of horror film to something like The Witch or what the Blair Witch was trying to be. And but I mean, back on topic, yeah, Blair Witch isn't going to make it in that list because it's just average. I would say below average. If I was going to give it a score, I would say 4 out of 10, which isn't terrible. I would say like a 2 out of 10 would be terrible. 2 verging on 3 would be like a bad film. I didn't have a terrible time watching it, but I didn't really enjoy myself either. And it's not something that I will end up picking up when it comes out to buy. So, you know, I got a fairly cheap cinema ticket, spent like £6 on it, and that's probably all the money that I'm going to give that film. I'm not going to buy it. So, yeah, if you're a fan of kind of like those kind of like horror tropes and horror films, then by all means, you may very well enjoy it. A lot of people have been enjoying it. But for me, it's just distinctly average, slightly below average. And I was disappointed after the first film being what I consider to be like one of the best horror films, if not one of the best, then one of the most important horror films of the 90s. Then this just kind of like fails. In fact, what was it? Was it the 90s? I'm sure Blair Witch was 94. I'm actually going to very quickly check. I'm fairly certain it was 1994. 1999, sorry. 99. But yeah, still like 90s horror film. So yeah, just disappointed, and it's a real shame. I really wanted to enjoy it, but I just couldn't. It just tried to modernize it too much, and it forgot to put the atmosphere in, apart from like 1 or 2 little bits, which it just squanders with the jump scares. So yeah, that was my thoughts on Blair Witch. I'm going to cut it here because I've been talking for like half an hour now. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please click like, comment and subscribe, and I will see you next time.